Hi, this is Chris McKaylee, a principal with the Sacramento Governmental Relations firm of Aprea and McKaylee, and an adjunct professor at McGeorge School of Law. And today's podcast is on providing an overview of the actions by Governor Gavin Newsom at the conclusion of the 2021 California legislative session, and a few historical notes to put his 2021 actions into perspective. California's 2021 legislative session actually concluded in the early evening of September the 10th. The governor had until October the 10th of 2021 to act on the hundreds of bills that reached his desk during the final weeks of the legislative session. He concluded his work actually a day and a half early, mid-afternoon on October the 9th, which was pretty unprecedented unto itself. There were just over 800 bills that reached the governor's desk this year, including close to 700 in the final month of the legislative session. So the total sent to the governor's desk in the 2021 legislative session was 836 bills. There were 2,421 bills that were introduced this year. The Senate had 828 bills introduced, and the Assembly had 1,593. So by my estimation, 34.5% of the bills that were introduced, of those 2,421, actually made it to the governor's desk. A total of 32% of the bills that were introduced this year actually got signed into law, and just shy of 3% of the bills that were introduced were vetoed. So let's take a little bit more detailed look at Governor Newsom's final stats for the 2021 session. Again, the total number of bills that reached his desk were 836. He signed 770 of them, which represents 92.1% of all the bills that reached his desk were signed. And 66 were vetoed, which means 7.9% of the bills were vetoed. Now I want to break them down based upon Assembly bills and Senate bills, as well as the party affiliation of the bill's authors. So beginning with the 770 signed bills, 66% of them were Assembly bills, leaving 34% of the signed bills were Senate bills. So of the ABs that were signed by Governor Newsom, 75% were authored by Democrats, 11.5% were authored by Republicans, and the remaining 13.5% were ABs that were committee bills or by the independent legislator. Of the 34% of the signed bills that were Senate bills, 76% of those SBs were authored by Democrats, 8.5% by Republicans, and 15.5% were committee bills. So turning to the 66 vetoed bills, again, the breakdown there is quite similar. 68% of the vetoed bills were Assembly bills, and therefore 32% of the vetoed bills were SBs. Now, the partisan breakdown is as follows. Of the ABs, 91% were authored by Democrats, 4% of the ABs vetoed were authored by Republicans, and 5% of those ABs vetoed were either committee bills or by the independent legislator. Of the SBs that were vetoed, 86% were authored by Democrats and 14% were authored by Republicans. So what happened with the first 2 years of Governor Newsom's bill actions? Well, last year in 2020, during Governor Newsom's second year in office, and recall, 9 weeks of the session were actually lost to the pandemic. So the total number of introduced bills were actually reduced by 3/4. 76% of all the bills introduced in the 2020 legislative session were dropped by the wayside. So just over 425 bills were sent to the governor. He vetoed 13% of those. Of the signed bills last year in 2020, 68.5% were ABs, 79%, almost 80% of them were Democrat authored, and 5.5% were authored by Republicans. The remaining amount, of course, were committee bills. So that left 31.5% of the signed bills were SBs, and of those, 69% were authored by Democrats and 12% were authored by Republicans. And again, the remaining signed bills were committee bills. How about the bills vetoed last year in the 2020 session by the governor? 64% were ABs, and 89% were authored by Democrats and 11% by Republicans. So 36% of the vetoed bills were SBs in 2020. 95% of the vetoed bills were authored by Democrats and just 5% by Republicans. And lastly, the governor's first year in office, the 2019 session, 1,016 bills were signed and 201 bills were vetoed. That was a 16.5% veto rate, his highest of the 3 years so far in office. 65% of the signed bills were ABs, and 79% of the ABs were authored by Democrats. 77% of the SBs signed were authored by Democrats, almost a similar number. And then finally, of the vetoed bills, those 201 in the 2019 session, 74% were ABs, and 84% of those ABs vetoed were authored by Democrats. 94% of the SBs that were vetoed were authored by Democrats. So the last thing I wanted to share with you on this podcast is looking back historically on bills getting to the governor's desk. And we'll look at the prior 4 governors. During Governor Brown's second, remember he did 8 years previously, in his second stint of 8 years, between 850 and 1,200 bills were sent to the governor's desk annually, and he vetoed a low of 10% to a high of 15%. During Governor Schwarzenegger's 7 years in office, between 900 and 1,250 bills were sent to him annually. He had a low veto rate of 22% and a high veto rate of 35%. In Governor Gray Davis's 5 years in office, between 950 bills and 1,450 bills roughly got to his desk annually. He vetoed a low of 6% and a high of 25%. And then lastly, during Governor Pete Wilson's 8 years in office, between 1,050 and 1,700 bills got down to Governor Wilson's desk. He vetoed a low of 8% and a high of 24%. So that gives you a historical look to put in perspective Governor Newsom's actions this year and the prior 2 years. Thanks for joining today's podcast.